I thought the worst part about living with a sleepwalker would be the noise. I was wrong. The worst part was checking the camera I hid in my room and realizing he was wide awake the entire time. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. I remember sitting in my car with the laptop balanced on my knees, watching that cheap, gray night vision footage over and over until the battery warning flashed on the screen. It wants a mistake, a glitch, a bad angle, anything except the truth. And the worst part wasn't that he came into my room. It wasn't even how long he'd been standing there. It was how calm he looked. Like he'd done it before, like he'd practiced. Like I was the last person in the apartment to realize what kind of person I was living with. And the second I understood that, every weird thing from the last month stopped feeling random. It all snapped together. The broken photo, the missing keys, the open door, the footsteps, the apologies. None of it was accidental. None of it was sleepwalking. It was a campaign. A slow, patient, deliberate effort to make me feel unsafe in my own home until I left willingly. And if I hadn't set up that camera, I honestly don't know how far he would have gone. Because by that point, he already knew something most predators know. They doubt themselves. They isolate. They rationalize. They stay quiet because they don't want to sound insane. That's where I was. And that's why, when people ask how I ended up trapped in an apartment with someone like that, I always tell them the same thing. Because he didn't look dangerous. He looked ideal. Second floor of an old brick building on a street that got too quiet after dark. Not cozy quiet. Dead quiet. The kind where every sound seems isolated, almost staged. The hallway lights buzzed. The pipes knocked at random hours. The windows leaked cold air, no matter how much you sealed them. But the rent was cheap. The location was decent. And after 2 straight weeks of scrolling through terrible listings and meeting people who seemed either unstable, filthy, or impossible to trust, I was relieved when I met him. He was already living there. Said the old roommate had moved in with his girlfriend and broken the lease early. He needed someone to take the second room fast. When I first walked in, the place was spotless, not tidy, not trying to impress me. Spotless, counters wiped down, shoes lined up by the wall. No overflowing trash, no stale smell, no weird stains. Even the furniture placement looked deliberate, almost too symmetrical. He was standing in the kitchen when I arrived, making tea, soft-spoken, clean-cut, maybe a little thin. The kind of face you'd forget immediately in a crowd, which somehow made him seem safer. Nothing pushy. He even said, "I know living with strangers is always a gamble, so if you want to ask me anything weird or specific, go ahead." People who are hiding something usually avoid giving you permission to look closely. And for the first week, it really did feel like I'd gotten lucky. He was the kind of roommate people brag about. He paid rent early, replaced things before they ran out, wiped down the sink after shaving, never left the bathroom humid, never had loud friends over, never drank, never partied, never blasted TV through the wall. Sometimes I barely even knew he was home. And in that first stretch, I started relaxing. I'd come back from work, kick off my shoes, hear some soft movement in the kitchen, and feel stable. That matters more than people think. When your home life is calm, you stop bracing. You unclench. You start believing you've finally found somewhere you can sleep. Then, around the end of the first week, he gave me the warning. It was casual. Too casual, looking back. I was microwaving leftovers. He was rinsing a mug. And he said, without turning around, "Hey, just so you know, I sleepwalk sometimes." He smiled, but it was a tight, embarrassed kind of smile. Then he said, "Actually, not sometimes. Pretty bad." I asked what pretty bad meant. He shrugged and said, "Usually just wandering into the kitchen, opening cabinets, standing around. I've done it since I was a kid. It's stupid. I remember telling him that was fine. He said, "If you ever see it, don't wake me up. I read, that's the worst thing you can do." Then he laughed again, quieter this time. Because everything else about him was so normal, I accepted it immediately. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was assuming that a warning means honesty. Sometimes a warning is just camouflage. Sometimes people tell you exactly enough truth to make the lie believable. For a little while after that, nothing happened. Then the small things started. I say small because if you've ever been psychologically cornered by someone, you know that's how it begins. Not with violence, not with some dramatic event, with tiny breaches, tiny distortions, things that can still be explained away. The first one was the framed photo. It was a picture of me and my sister from a few years earlier. Nothing expensive, just something I kept on the dresser. I woke up one morning, stepped out of bed, and nearly cut my foot on the glass. The frame was shattered on the floor. Not fallen flat, shattered. The backing had popped off. The glass was spread wider than it should have been if it had just slipped. The photo itself had a crease through the middle. I stood there staring at it, still half asleep, trying to reconstruct how it could have happened. Maybe I knocked it getting into bed. Maybe the dresser shifted. Maybe it had been closer to the edge than I remembered. That last thought mattered. Because once you start supplying innocent explanations, you become part of your own manipulation. When he saw me sweeping up the glass, he immediately asked what happened. I said I didn't know. He froze for a second, then gave a quiet, miserable little nod and said, "It might have been me." I looked at him. He rubbed the back of his neck and avoided eye contact. Sometime during the night, he said, "I don't remember anything, but if I was wondering, maybe I came in here. I'm really sorry." He apologized in a way that would have been hard to fake if I didn't know, now that it was fake. Not over the top, not theatrical. He even offered to replace the frame, so I let it go. Then my keys disappeared. That sounds minor until it's your actual life getting jammed up by it. Checked under the couch, under the bed, in shoes, jacket pockets, the bathroom, the trash. Gone. I was standing in the kitchen, already sweating, already furious, when he walked in holding them. He said he'd found them in the freezer. I actually laughed at first. Just one sharp, confused laugh. Because what else are you supposed to do when your house keys turn up next to a bag of frozen vegetables? He didn't laugh. He looked sick, and he said it again. It was probably me. Last night, sleepwalking. Then he started apologizing. Over and over. Too much, maybe. But not enough to trigger suspicion. Just enough to trigger sympathy. That was his real talent. Not scaring me. Managing my reaction to being scared. Every time something happened, he met it first with embarrassment, which forced me into the role of the understanding one. And once you're in that role, it's hard to climb back out. Because then you start sounding cruel. You start sounding irrational. You become the person accusing a guy of intentional harm over things he says he does unconsciously. So I told myself to be patient. I told myself some people really do have severe parasomnias. I told myself the apartment was old. I told myself stress was making me sensitive. Then my bedroom door opened. That was different. Because I locked it every night. Not because I was afraid of him. At least not then. It was just habit. A thing I'd always done, even living alone. Check the stove, check the window, lock the bedroom door, sleep. Simple. One night I woke up with that awful, primitive feeling that something was wrong before I even opened my eyes. You know the feeling. Not wide, just enough. Just enough for the hallway darkness to sit there and watch me. I got up immediately. Checked the lock, ran my fingers over the knob. Looked for scratches, damage, anything. Nothing. The next morning, I brought it up. He didn't get defensive. He didn't deny it. He just went pale and started apologizing again. Said he must have opened it in his sleep. Said he felt horrible. Said he understood if I wanted to put something in front of the door at night. Said maybe he needed to see a specialist again. Again, that word stuck with me because it implied history, treatment, a condition. It made the whole thing feel documented, medical, tragic, and I hated how convincing that was. So I started adapting, not because I fully believed him, because I wanted to believe him. I put a chair under the doorknob one night, a metal water bottle against the door another. I started checking the room before bed, then checking again. I slept lighter. I noticed more. Floorboards in the hallway, slow pressure in the wood, a single step, then another, then silence. I told myself it was the building settling. Then one night, I heard what sounded like a hand on my doorknob, not turning it, just resting there. I lay in bed, staring at the dark, every muscle locked. After a few seconds, it went away. The next morning, he was making coffee like nothing had happened. He looked tired. He smiled at me and asked if I slept okay. That was the first time I felt actual hatred. Not fear, hatred, because there was something obscene about how normal he looked in daylight, how easy it was for him. After that, the apartment started feeling smaller. Not physically, psychologically. Every room began to feel shared, in the worst possible way. I'd leave for work and come back with the immediate sense that something had shifted. Not enough to prove, just enough to feel. A drawer slightly more open than I remembered. A shirt on the wrong hanger. My toothbrush angled differently. My shower towel folded wrong. I know how that sounds. That's the whole problem. Predatory behavior like that often sounds ridiculous. When you describe it plainly, too petty, too subtle. But subtle violations pile up. They collect. And after a while, your nervous system starts living ahead of you. You're not in your apartment anymore. You're in a surveillance state. The next major incident happened on a Thursday. I came home exhausted, opened my bedroom door, and just stopped. The bed had been stripped. Sheets gone, blanket gone, pillowcase missing. The bare mattress was exposed, like some kind of hospital bed. My pillow was on the floor near the closet. The closet door was open, and the window above the radiator was cracked open, just enough to let cold air in. There was dirt on the carpet beneath it, not a lot. A few dark marks, like someone had stood there in shoes, shifting their weight. I didn't even call out for him. I didn't move. I just stood in that doorway with my work bag still on my shoulder, and felt something inside me go very still. Because even if I used his explanation, sleepwalking, there was a meanness to that arrangement. The stripped bed, the open closet, the cracked window, the dirt. It looked staged. It looked like someone had entered my room and curated discomfort. That night, he knocked on my door around 10. Softly. I opened it halfway. He was holding one of my pillowcases. He looked ashamed again. Said he found it in the kitchen. I guess you'll have to kick me out before I accidentally redecorate your whole room. He wanted it to land like a joke. It didn't. Because jokes have an edge of shared understanding. That had an edge of testing. Like he was checking how much pressure I could take before I cracked. Said he was serious about seeing a doctor. Said he knew this was unfair to me. Then he went back to his room. I stood there for a full minute after he left, staring at the hall. Something had changed, not in him, in me. Until then, I'd been reacting. That was the first night I decided I needed proof, not reassurance. Not another conversation. Proof. I didn't want to tip him off by getting packages delivered. And honestly, by then I felt stupid for not having done it sooner. So I used what I had, an old laptop. I put it on my desk, facing the bed and the door. Checked the angle twice. Dimmed the screen until it was nearly black. Made sure it was plugged in. Started recording. Then I went through the rest of my normal routine as quietly as I could. Bathroom light, water, toothbrush, lamp off. Because when you decide to gather proof against someone you live with, you cross an invisible line. You're no longer hoping you're wrong. You're preparing to confirm you're right. And I think deep down I already knew. I just needed the part of my brain that still wanted this to be explainable to shut up. Listening so hard that every noise started blending together. The old radiator ticking, a car passing outside, somebody in another unit flushing a toilet, the soft electrical hum of the laptop. Then nothing. Morning, gray light through the blinds, and that weird, disorienting feeling of waking up after anxiety sleep where you don't feel rested. You feel interrupted. The first thing I did was check the laptop. The recording had saved. I stared at the file for a few seconds without opening it. I can't explain that properly unless you felt it yourself. That split second where evidence is still just potential, and you're afraid of collapsing it into certainty. Because uncertainty is miserable, but certainty can ruin your life. I took the laptop, my charger, and my keys and walked out to the car. I wanted distance. I wanted walls between us before I knew. I parked 2 streets away in front of a closed laundromat and opened the video. At first, it was nothing, just darkness. My room in washed-out grayscale. Me asleep under the blanket. Occasional headlights sliding across the ceiling like something underwater. I skipped ahead. 1:12 a.m. Nothing. 1:58 a.m. Nothing. 2:31 a.m. Nothing. I started feeling stupid. Started thinking maybe I'd built this into something bigger than it was. Then I hit 3 a.m. and the door opened. Not fast, not clumsy, slowly, carefully, like whoever was entering knew exactly how much pressure the latch could take without making noise. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him with one hand. Then he turned toward the bed. No sway, no confusion, no blank expression. He was fully alert. That was obvious instantly. There's a difference between movement and intention. You can see it even in bad footage. He wasn't wandering. He was placing each foot. His shoulders were relaxed. His head was level. His eyes were open, wide open. And he was smiling. It wasn't exaggerated. That would have been easier, somehow. This was worse. A thin smile. Private. Content. He walked to the end of my bed and just stood there, staring down at me. I looked at the timestamp. 3:01, still there. 3:07, still there. 3:16, still there. At one point, he leaned slightly to the left, like he was trying to study my face from another angle. And he straightened again. My skin went cold watching it. Not because I imagined it, because I knew exactly where I had been in that moment. Asleep, defenseless. A few feet from someone who had already been inside my room more times than I could count. At 3:22, he moved to the side of the bed, slowly lowered one hand, touched the edge of the blanket near my leg. Not enough to wake me, just enough to know he could. Then he pulled his hand back and watched for a reaction. I actually gagged, just once, dry and violent, because the intimacy of it was so wrong. People think fear is always about threat of death. Sometimes it's worse than that. Learning how to get close without consequences. I kept watching. He stayed there, minutes stretched. 3:40, 3:53, 4:11. Sometimes he looked at the door, sometimes at the window, but mostly at me. Then, around 4:26, he bent down, lower and lower until his face was near mine. The laptop microphone was cheap, so the sound was thin, buried in electrical hiss. I turned the volume all the way up, listened once, twice, a third time, and I heard it, soft, calm, almost affectionate. "You can leave now, or I can keep doing this until you start begging to. And a tiny laugh, not a maniac laugh, not cinematic, a real laugh, small, satisfied, like he'd made a private joke for himself. That was the moment the whole story changed. Up until then, there was still this pathetic corner of my brain trying to preserve some alternate explanation. That killed it. He wasn't sick. He wasn't sleepwalking. He was trying to break me down until leaving felt like my idea. And once I accepted that, every previous incident became evidence of method. The photo wasn't random. He wanted to violate something sentimental. The keys in the freezer weren't random. He wanted me late, stressed, disoriented. The open door wasn't random. He wanted me to wake into vulnerability. The stripped bed, the dirt, the moved objects, all of it was designed to create instability without leaving obvious proof. He was building a version of the apartment where I was never fully alone, never fully secure, never fully sure. That's what predators like him count on, not physical strength, plausible deniability. Because if I told people, what would it sound like? My roommate says he sleepwalks, and sometimes my stuff gets moved. That doesn't sound like terror. It sounds like inconvenience. Even the footage, if I hadn't caught the whisper, some people probably still would have tried to explain it away. Maybe he was checking on me. Maybe he was confused. Maybe there was context. There's always context for people like that. I remember looking up from the laptop and realizing my hands were shaking so hard I could barely close it. And then I had this awful thought. What if he'd seen the laptop? What if he knew I knew? What if he had gone back into my room that morning and realized it was gone? I looked at the apartment building in the rearview mirror from 2 streets over and felt, for the first time, the full weight of the situation. All my clothes were still there. My wallet back up, my documents, my work stuff, everything. And still, I couldn't make myself go back through the front door. Because once you know someone has been standing over your unconscious body at night, the normal rules disappear. Forget lease agreements. Forget furniture. Forget being polite. Forget not overreacting. Overreacting is a luxury for people in safe situations. What I had was evidence of intent, and intent was enough. I called in sick to work, drove to a coffee shop parking lot, and sat there for almost an hour trying to decide what the smartest move was. Police? Maybe. But I knew how that conversation would begin. And I knew how badly I needed to be away from him before I started trying to persuade strangers. Landlord? Eventually? Friend? I should have called one sooner, but fear makes you stupid and pride makes you slower. I just kept replaying the whisper. You can leave now. As if he was giving me a choice. As if he was being generous. And I remembered my bedroom window, 2nd floor, old fire escape access just below. Easy enough if you didn't mind dropping onto cold metal. And suddenly the whole thing seemed simple, not safe. Simple. I drove back after dark. Not because that was smart. Because I knew he'd be home. And I was afraid if he wasn't, I'd lose my nerve and go inside the normal way. I parked behind the building, killed the headlights, sat there listening to my own breathing. His bedroom light was on. Mine was dark. I came up the back way, used the exterior ledge to reach my window, and got it open with more force than I expected. The old frame gave with a dry crack that sounded way too loud. I froze. No movement inside, no voice. I climbed in. The room smelled wrong. Not bad, just disturbed. Like stale air and fabric and someone else's skin. My laptop charger was gone from the wall. The desk chair was angled differently. My closet door was open again. I didn't check the rest. I didn't want confirmation that he'd been back in there after I left. I grabbed what I could in seconds. Wallet, work bag, phone charger, prescription bottle, a hoodie. That was it. And as I was turning back toward the window, I heard movement in the hallway. Not rushed, slow, measured, coming toward my room. Every part of me locked up. One step, then another. Then the sound stopped just outside the door. I could see the faint shadow of shoes beneath the gap. He knew. Or maybe he was checking. Maybe he'd heard the window. Maybe he did this every night. I don't know. What I do know is that he didn't knock. He just stood there, on the other side of the door, silent, the exact same way he had stood over my bed, waiting, maybe smiling, maybe listening to me breathe. And in that moment, I understood something I wish I'd understood a month earlier. People like that don't always need to touch you to hurt you. Sometimes it's enough that they know where your mind will go if they just give it darkness and silence. I didn't pack. I just grabbed my laptop, climbed out the window, and left. I never went back. If you want to hear more stories of betrayal, check out the video on your screen now.